and the windows. The windows are the portholes. Okay. Hello, and welcome to a video series called The Whys of Worship, in which we will explore why we do what we do when we come together to worship God. But to begin with, we need to know why we do what we do, where we do. I'm standing in front of a building we call a church. But why do we call this building a church? Where did that word come from, and what does it mean? If you look in an English Bible, you'll see the word church come up a few times in the New Testament. For instance, when St. Paul writes his letters to the Corinthians, he addresses them to the church in Corinth. The word we translate in English as church in Greek is ekklesia, which means called out of, and referred to an assembly, a group of people. It was used in ancient Greek culture in political and social ways, but the early Christian communities adopted this name for themselves. In New Testament terms, ekklesia referred to the gathering, the assembly of Christians, in other words, the people. When Paul says to the church in Corinth, he's not talking to a building, he's talking to the group of people who worshiped God. They didn't even have a designated building yet. They met in people's houses. At some point, having a little to do with the confusing nature of the history of the English language, we started calling the building where we worship a church as well. So, the church building is the place where the church, the group of people, worships God. We'll talk about what worship is in a later video, but it's important to know that this church building is here not because this place is any holier than any other place in God's creation, but because the people who worshiped God in this community had these assets and dedicated them to the worship of God. So, you are the church, and this is also our church. Let's take a look inside. Now we are inside the church. This is the space we typically worship God. This is not the only space God can be worshiped, a fact that has been brought home to us during this pandemic. During the last year and a half, we have worshiped at home or outside as much as we have in here. But this is the space our forebears set apart to worship God. And they designed the space and the appointments within it to enhance our corporate worship of God when the church, the assembly, comes together. This interior space I am standing in has various names. Most people know it as the sanctuary. Historically speaking, though, only that part up front around the altar was called the sanctuary, the sacred space. The main part was called the nave, from the Latin word we also get navel and navy from, because these spaces were traditionally designed to look like a ship. Early Christians had adopted the ship as a symbol for the church. It is the boat from which we fish for people. It is the ark of salvation carrying us through the chaotic waters with Christ as our pilot and the cross as our masthead. And if you look at the ceiling, this nave was designed this way too, to look like an upside-down ship. The ceiling is the keel and the windows are the portholes. At some point, the term nave fell out of use. Not every modern church is designed this way, after all, and the term sanctuary expanded to refer to the whole worship space. In the next video, we'll talk about the traditional sanctuary, what we call the chancel, all that stuff up front and what it symbolizes. But Let's just take a moment to appreciate the whole. Psalm 96:9 says, "Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness." And so we try to make our worship spaces beautiful. And I think they did a fantastic job with this space. Don't you? But before I let you go, I wanted to draw your attention to a technological advancement that took the body of Christ all over the world by storm and revolutionized our worship spaces the world over. Meet the pew. It's a pretty newfangled contraption in the history of the worship of God. So is the concept of sitting down during a worship service. Now, Lutherans do a fair amount of standing in our worship services, but prior to the Protestant Reformation, pretty much everyone stood the whole time. There were no seats. People just kind of milled around during worship in the vast open space. A few years ago, we removed all of the pews so we could refinish the floors. And I remember looking at that open space and thinking, it would make a great place for a roller skate party or a dance party during the hymns and worship. Now, there's no evidence that Christians in the 1400 years prior to when pews were invented held skating parties or dance parties, but there's also no evidence that they didn't. So you decide. Too much. Pews became popular after the Protestant Reformation, with the new emphasis on the sermon in worship, to have a place to sit and listen. But in the early years, you paid for your pew. Rich patrons would purchase a pew for their family, and their money would help fund the church building and renovations. You might act like you own the pew you sit in, but back in the day, people actually did. If you couldn't afford a pew, you didn't have one. It really wasn't until the 19th century that the concept of free and open pews for everyone became a standard practice in churches. And thank goodness, because it's kind of dangerous to fall asleep during a sermon when you're standing up. And you might not want to pay for the privilege of falling asleep in a pew, but if it's free,